It's the Misfits.
All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to a KFM production. We are combining a lot of different shows with this one and really just using this as an opportunity to be able to geek out about something that both of us absolutely love. So, November 29th is the birthday of the writer C.S. Lewis, and we have approached this whole topic of the Narniad, talking Narnia, all of that is kind of a year in making, because we hear a lot of different takes from the about the Narniad from the larger audience, from some of the circles that we are in, and it is time to finally talk about it. And as the broadcast network's resident Narnia expert, I figure what better time than now to lead the discussion. So Narnia is one of those stories that many of us in the Christian world have experience with. Now, I do think it's a little funny that, being the angsty rocker of the group, if you will, the guy that doesn't necessarily do the usual path, that I have come to love and appreciate this series as much as I do, because for many I know have this, youthful exposure to this series, right? Something like grade school, something like youth group, where this is kind of a Christian's first segue into the world of fantasy. Whereas for me, I was in my late 20s when I first discovered the Narniad. It wasn't long after I had first became a Christian, and I had known about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I had known about C.S. Lewis, and I knew about Aslan in broad strokes from my exposure to church and church culture, but I didn't really have I wasn't really long in the tooth as far as understanding the beats that make up this complex, interwoven series of stories that make up the Narniad until I was well into my adult life. So I'm guessing, because you look and sound and smell a whole lot more like a pastor than I do, that you have some kind of, like I said, youthful exposure to this story.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly don't remember if it was grade school or if it was just my mom, but it was one of those two, and it was like maybe second or third grade even, that was the case. And that was before the movies were coming out. That was before, there was the BBC series with it. I think there was probably some really horribly done animated cartoon version of it probably at the same time.
Yep.
But it was something that was introduced early, and it was actually part of the elementary school reading curriculum at the Christian school that I was going to. So, I mean, it wasn't just like, it wasn't just like, well, we know what it is. It was like, this was actually part of the reading curriculum that we had. So yeah, I mean, I probably had more of it as an on-ramp than you did, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's funny when I look at the varied responses to fantasy and even to the Narniad that I see across Christendom, where you have folks like yourself that grew up in the Christian environment, that grew up in Christian school, and so this is the one, right? This is the one that's okay, even though it's got some of the same beats as some of these others. This is the one that's acceptable because we have Lion Jesus, because we have this gigantic allegory to the biblical narrative. And unfortunately, and I can say this approaching as, yes, I approached it as a Christian, approaching as an academic, I can say, unfortunately, the whole thing being treated as if it's one giant allegorical approach to the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So
the first thing with that is the easiest thing just to get out of the way, is that the reason why it is the one that is most commonly acceptable, even though I have heard from certain Christian groups where even Narnia is considered off limits. Like it's pagan, it's witchcraft, and so we don't go near it. Right. The reason that it's the most acceptable is simply because Lewis doesn't hide anything. Yeah. He makes it too simple to figure out, which is part of why he and Tolkien butted heads on it. But it was so simple to figure out because it was meant to be a story for young children. It wasn't meant to be this great academic piece that we now have made it into. So it is so simple that it becomes very hard for people to twist it into something else, as opposed to other fantasy pieces that are doing Christian allegory stuff where you actually have to sit and think about what is this that the writer is saying. I mean, Lewis literally will have Aslan quote scripture that Jesus said, talking about himself, to make it absolutely clear who it is that we're supposed to see as Jesus here. I mean, so it's more so because of how simple it's written is why it's accepted, not because of the subject matter necessarily is why it's accepted.
Right. Especially because you take a look at the core elements of this story and you find a lot of overlap. Now, high geeks will sit here and say, well, it's a different type of magic. It's a different style of fantasy. It's the whole idea of mythological creatures is presented in a different way, and thus, it's not the same as something like a Harry Potter or something like that. And so, there are some negotiations made there, but I want to absolutely 1000% correct something that you said.
Go for it.
It's not that it was written to not be interrogated and analyzed and thought deeply about. It's that it was written in a presentation style to be more accessible. Whereas something like the Tolkien series was presented with more of an adult spin on it, where somebody who has more of a formed mind and has more of a fully formed knowledge base would be approaching that, whereas this was supposed to be something that is more accessible, but not written to not be interrogated or to be intellectual in nature. Because when you get through Narnia, when you go through the entirety of the Narniad, there are some really big concepts that are involved in the world building and in the presentation. it's written in a way where you are given some of the moving pieces before the beginning of the world is ever established, before you are even given a creation account or being clued into who all of these moving pieces are. You are given the gravity of the situation and a world in turmoil before you are given the explanation of how the world came to be or how the world was brought into turmoil. Also, you are presented with a concept that now we would call metaphysics. We would call multi-dimensional theory, where you have this nexus point where you can access this whole multiverse of worlds where only one of them is Narnia and only one of them is Earth, but you also have all of these other worlds on top of. And so you even have a metaphysical concept where the world is stacked. You've got Narnia, and then stacked is Aslan's country, and then stacked is Earth, and then stacked is all of these different worlds, where it's like when you go through these different portals in this nexus point between worlds, you are literally going from one layer and dropping to another layer, or going up to another layer and going that way. That's basically, in a nutshell, anybody who tries to take a metaphysical approach to trying to say, hey, the world's flat, would take that kind of approach. And so that's a concept that Lewis is pulling in when establishing the breadth of what makes up this multiverse that is contained within the Narniad.
Yeah, so I've got a question for you here. And this is something where at first I was going to say, well, maybe it's too deep for this discussion, but then you brought up metaphysics, so I don't think anything is too deep anymore. So
we're in there.
Oh yeah, we're deep. We're deep in. So here's the question, because I like what you said there about the idea of, he presents a problem, he presents this world without giving us the backstory.
Right.
But enough information that we know what's going on, and we see the strife, and we see in the allegorical, the spiritual battle going on, we see all this kind of stuff going on. Do you think that some of it is, again, one of those things where if we actually look at who would have been reading this originally, where this was much more of what a, shortly post World War II audience was dealing with, in terms of, we don't even care about the backstory, we just need to look at the evil that's right here with us right now?
Yes. So I think there are many aspects of the Narniad that fall into the category that you just presented. And in the concept that you just presented is a huge reason why Narnia took the shape that it did. Lewis was in a culture where nothing really looked good. There wasn't a lot of brightness to be seen within the world around him. And you're talking about a guy that from his youth was a Christian, and then by every standard and measurement went through hell growing up and walked away from his faith. And it was in his 30s that he reestablished his faith. And so this is a man that saw every side of the coin and was not afraid of saying, hey, look, there's a world around us that's tough, that has struggle, that is deep and complex, but also, if you look hard enough and if you allow yourself to see it, there are aspects that are still beautiful, even in the midst of the chaos and the struggle that are going on, even down to the actual topography of the map of Narnia. It's based strongly off of Ireland and where he grew up and what he knew, including these different regions where, if you watch as the story unfolds from a publication order perspective, you see, oh, okay, so we've got this group over here. We've got the Calormans. We've got these different groups that we don't really know a lot about them. They're distant over there. That would make all of the sense in the world to the original readers, because these kids that this is being written for only know chaos around them, just like the adults only know struggle around them for the most part. And so that's the beauty and the power that's drawn out within the Narniad, which actually brings me to the first point that I would like to bring up in all of this, that helps to understand and wrap our mind around how you really come to understand the full complexity of the Narniad. Before I get to that, though, you look like you want to jump in.
I just wanted to point out the topography thing, because we didn't plan this, but if you look at my head, the topography looks like I apparently have been named king. Just pointing that out actually. There. So just a fun thing for those watching. Now, carry on to the actual important point that you're trying to get to.
Right. So, many people approach the Narniad as if the entire Narniad, now I'm using that language, pay attention to what I'm saying here, the entirety of the Narniad is a giant allegory. Mm-hmm. That is unequivocally a false statement. It is not. Said by Lewis himself. And contrary to what popular belief may have you believe, Tolkien didn't say that either. Now, there was tension between the two. Yes, they took different approaches to fantasy writing and all of that. And that part of it is absolutely very well established. But what was also established is that these two men were both a part of a group called the Inklings, that they were very good friends, a part of a group of writers who many of which would go on to be some of the most influential writers known to literature. So you're talking almost like a superhero team of different literary giants within this group. And so there was a deep connection, but there was also conflict. There was also difference of perspective. But Tolkien never said that the entire thing is one giant allegory, nor did Lewis. That being said, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the easiest ways to point out what he's talking about is just in the order that he wrote these stories.
Exactly.
He did not write creation first and then salvation and then the rest of the tale. It was the salvation allegory, a bunch of tales, creation, destruction. There's not a way to say that this was meant to be one long, big allegory if you actually look at the order that he wrote them. And he makes it, he said, I don't know how many times he had it in written form where he talks about the fact that he does not care which order you read these things in. He just wants you to read them and understand them. He doesn't care when you read them or what order or anything like that.
Yeah. So reading order is a conversation that we are going to have, but not quite yet.
Yeah.
So if it's not an allegory, then what is it? Now, Lewis I believe it was Lewis that coined this phrase, a supposal.
I
Now,
think so.
a,
Yeah.
sup- a supposal is a form of literature that takes something that's cemented in real life and says, what if? What if this? What if that? And the entire basis of how the story is written is a summation of what ifs that can also use different literary styles baked within the supposal. So I say it like that because we cannot get around the idea of the closest aspects of Narnia being an allegory are contained within The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that is most commonly why the entire thing gets labeled
Hmm.
as a giant Christian allegory. You cannot deny that there are heavy Christian themes. But if you check out groups like Homebrewed Christianity, Tolkien Heads, these different groups that really investigate heavily Tolkien's works as well, Tolkien's works are also very heavily influenced by
Hmm.
Christian themes. But even within The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I would argue that yes, there may be an allegory for Aslan and Jesus, that Lewis basically writes Aslan to be a different form, like Jesus having taken a different form, that even The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe isn't really an allegory, because when you try to fit in the puzzle pieces to say, oh, this character is an allegory for this character and this event is an allegory for this event, it starts to fall apart. It doesn't really actually work out, because then you would have to make Edmund into Judas, and that doesn't work out. You would have to make the stone table into the cross, and that doesn't really work out. Yes, you do have the Christ figure raising from the dead. So I'm not saying that the themes are completely absent from this thing, but the second that you allow yourself to say, okay, I'm not trying to fit Christian themes into every single moment of this story, but it's an author saying, suppose this happened instead.
Hmm.
Suppose this is the world. Suppose that you have this giant fantasy world with talking creatures and big bads and all of these things going on, but also you have a metaphysical situation that allows for the introduction of Santa to
Hmm.
also be present in this world, this structure that allows for different people to be able to come in and engage with him and be able to experience things in this world while also being of a different world. Then
Hmm.
the doors are blown wide open for this to become one of the most intricate and complex fantasy worlds to ever be created.
And it's, the way I typically, and you can correct me if I'm using the terms wrong, but the way I typically have talked about it, and Tolkien actually is easier to explain this sort of thing, but it's the same sort of thing we see going on with Lewis, is that the rather than talking about it as an allegory, is a perfect opportunity to actually explain to Christians what mythology actually is.
Yeah.
Because mythology is about the message of the story living on, not necessarily the specific minute details living on. And so that's what we see with, I mean, it's very easy with Tolkien, because Tolkien even lays it out within, in multiple places within some of the monologues that you've got, of things like, it was history, and then it was legend, and then it was myth. And it became myth because we forgot certain pieces. But the message still lived on, even in the myth. Within Narnia, we have the same sort of things going on. I mean, again, we start out in the middle of the story, but even in the middle of the story, we hear there's been that this whole event was prophesied a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
Like, this was all planned out long, long time ago. It was all prophesied long, long time ago. And so the message is so it is very much a fiction writing, but is a fiction writing that is a Christocentric mythology. The message of Christ and what Christ does, you can't deny is in the story. But it's not going to give you details of the story and be like, well, this is Judas, this is a cross, this. No, this is the message of who God is and what God does, is that he will sacrifice himself for creation to set things right. That's the message. That's the allegory. We don't need to try to make all these other pieces fit. I mean, we say it all the time, but this is literally the place where we say this is where to rest in the story. Enjoy the story. Hear the message, enjoy the message. We don't have to work extra hard to make it into something that it's not.
Yeah. So a couple of things about what you said. I would largely agree with what you said. The biggest difference between Tolkien and Lewis is that Lewis had no problem showing and not telling.
Yeah.
He had no problem incorporating something into a story without going into hyper realized detail. Whereas Tolkien, he had a singular work that he poured all of himself into, that is the set of stories that make up the Exactly. And so for those of you that are listening, Andrew just held up the Silmarillion, right? Did I say that correctly? I think I said that.
I have no idea how you say it. It's the one that everybody wants to read and then starts doing and is like, wow, this is way too complicated for me to get through.
Yeah, exactly. So he had this one giant singular vision that he goes into great detail to flush out, to establish, to add to really bring to life. And I give a lot of credit. A lot of my orientation you are going to hear is towards Lewis's style of writing versus Tolkien's style of writing. But that is not to take anything away from what that whole Middle Earth world is. But Tolkien wants to tell you every single solitary bit of what is going on.
Literally down to what they ate for breakfast. Like literally he's going down to the breakfast menu. Yeah.
Right. And so Lewis understands that his target is not the person who wants to sit there and read every hyper realized detail, but what he is doing is taking those very same concepts and employing them so that way you can still see them lived out rather than actually explained beat for beat. Yeah. I'm hesitant to use some of the direct language that you used from a religious sense because there are themes, but even down to the themes, I think they still need to stay themes, even rather than saying this is an allegory for X, Y, or Z. Even to the way that he writes Aslan, he's taking a more mystics approach to expressing the idea of Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God and all of those kinds of things in the Trinity, and saying, what if Jesus took a different form and went into this other world and also did what he did in this other world, in this other form? And so that's where you kind of have to tread the line between what kind of terminology you use, because in order to preserve the accuracy of it.
Right.
So in establishing the story of Narnia, there are a couple of different paths that you can take. And this is where it kind of goes into, and for those that that are finding this because of Thoughts from a Bearded Geek, or finding this because of one of the other on-ramps that we have that you're not used to what Andrew and I do, we started off this show called Is It Pagan as kind of a joke, as kind of a rib about the whole Halloween thing. But then we started realizing
it was fully a joke, and then we just kept it going. Yeah,
because we kept finding things that we needed to address that people were calling pagan. And so that's why up in the upper right is our logo for Is It Pagan. And so hitting it from this angle, now's the point where, even though this doesn't look like a hyper realized version of Is It Pagan, like a standard episode of this sort of thing, this is where if you are hitting this and saying, okay, is it okay for my kid to be reading about mythological creatures or fantasy worlds or magic or different things like that? We're going to hit some of those themes here. So the story of Narnia is one that is told out of order in publication history. If you read it in publication order, you go through the establishment of the world, this idea of the kings and queens of Narnia, the kings and queens of Narnia being pulled back away from Narnia, back into the real world, where you are, where it is established that time works differently in the two worlds. And then you pick up with the kids being brought back. A whole lot of time has passed. The world is in disrepair and all of that. And so you get a series of 3 stories that build off of each other. And that's, from that point, is where you start to get out of order storytelling. Mm-hmm. And that was done on purpose. Now you have a different group of folks that will say the best way to read it is in chronological order, because then you have the establishment of the world, and then you kind of go through the series of events as best you can throughout the entirety of the canon. I think there's room in the conversation for both. I think that this is a yes and sort of dynamic to be had here, because
it's
both
the same
of them
argument.
shine.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same argument we have with Star Wars, right? Do we watch it 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9? Do we watch it 1 through 9? Do we watch it 1, 2 Clone Wars? Do we just ignore 7, 8, 9 altogether? It comes down to preference, is really what it comes down to.
Kind of, yes, that's an aspect of it, but it also depends. It depends on what you're trying to get out of the storytelling, and there are specifics that you can get out of both ways of doing it. There are some folks that have changed up the entirety of either reading order and have posited an entirely different reading order, because it gives you kind of the main problem and then the prequel, and then based off of that prequel and seeing how it started, immediately jumping to this is how it ends, and this is how the world is closed up. Whatever, enjoy it. Like whatever it is that you want to, however it is you want to do it, awesome. If you gain value out of reading it, that's fine. But in in an effort to best explain the world building that Lewis does, we are going to jump forward to the creation account that is in the fifth book. Yeah. So I think I'm getting fact checked. Yep. Immediately getting fact checked on this one. So go ahead and let me know when you have it.
Yeah.
So we have these kids that are brought into this fantasy world, but we don't immediately have this whole picture of kids are transported into this fantasy world that they get to see come to life. No, Lewis is taking the time to establish the counter argument to the good first in them going to Charn and being confronted by the White Witch, also known as Jadis. And go ahead.
It's number 6.
Oh, it is number 6. Okay. So yeah. I've read these books in a couple of different orders, so it's hard to keep it straight as far as publication order, but we press forward. So
yeah, we move on.
Yeah. So this is, he is brought to this world first and then is transported after having made the mistake of waking Jadis up into this seemingly dark void where it is inky black, and then the song begins. And they start to hear this noise that starts to spring forward life. The stars, the earth, creation, all brought forward from the sound of the lion's voice. But something interesting happens. They hear this beautiful sound. Jadis hears this horrific noise. And I will tell you, I am so hopeful that I think it's Netflix that has the rights currently. Go to town. This is one of those scenes that if done well, if done right, oh, this could be beautiful. This could be really, really something special. But I digress. We have the establishment of evil first, and then the establishment of the creation of this world without really actually knowing yet. I'm saying within the context of this book, without really knowing who this lion is or whether or not he's good or bad, and what role he plays in the entirety of the story. Now, in publication order, this is how you're learning the origin of the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve being kings and queens of Narnia. And so you have these characters being brought into this world where he's saying, okay, we're already establishing that there are several worlds within this universe. This is how Narnia is being created. And this is where we start to establish the rhythms that are then fully realized when we see the Pevensey children take the thrones, when we see Jadis fully vanquished, and we see Aslan in his full glory leading everybody to victory.
Yeah, the thing that I love with when we're to start to talk through like the creation stories and things like that, because I know the idea of music being the thing that is created is the same sort of thing that we see in Tolkien's world also. Music is what is used to create or anything like that. But the thing that that I love about both, and again, this is both Tolkien and Lewis do this, which Lewis I think is an even better example of it than Tolkien, is that it continues the theme that we see in scripture, the fact that the one creation account that we have throughout all mythology where chaos doesn't have to be reined in, that creation supersedes chaos, is in both Tolkien and in Lewis's worlds.
Yep.
Tolkien, it's more of just somebody's trying to be chaos, but in fact I intended it to be chaotic, and so it actually helps us build the story. But the thing with Narnia is that you've got the introduction of evil, then you have the introduction of the creator, and yet the first thing that the evil hears is chaos to them. It's beauty still to everybody else around. And then even when things like the lamppost accidentally gets planted, when Jadis is let free, when the first signs of sin and evil start to enter this kind of universe, nowhere in the midst of it is there ever any hint of it not still being beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's something that you don't have in most storytellings in general, but especially when we're dealing with creation stories, is that, and anybody that has read Lewis's actual like theological work knows this is kind of how he operates anyway. But this idea of the fact that even in the midst of when things should be chaotic and we should be talking about God taking control, Aslan doesn't have to take control. He just creates something beautiful.
Right.
And it's something that we don't see in other creation stories.
Right. Exactly. And so he's taking the time here to give a backstory as to the cooperation between Aslan and humans, and that this is this is a world where Aslan is choosing to cooperate with men and women to rule over this world that he has established. So again, we can't deny that there are themes present in these books, but it's supposing, what if this played differently? What if this other thing happened over here? Rather than a direct allegorical approach like what he takes in the Ransom trilogy. If you're looking for Lewis to write a far more beat for beat sort of account, turn to, so most people call them the Space Trilogy. I think that they should be called the Ransom Trilogy because I think the Space Trilogy is kind of a misnomer, but they are definitely different. They're definitely more sci-fi than they are fantasy, but it is far more on the nose. It is basically, if The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the most on the nose that the Narniad gets, it is that, but the entire series and the volume turned up. Yeah, essentially. Yeah. And so he does do that with his fiction works. It's just not here.
Yeah, and we actually, I don't think we did for Is It Pagan. I think it was strictly a Misfits episode where we actually kind of dove into that a little bit when we were talking about the idea of theology of aliens and things like that.
Yeah. When we did the theology of aliens, we started talking about the Space Trilogy.
Yeah. It is both the, I guess, irony and the beauty of the fact that we get to do this from the Is It Pagan kind of setting, is that the things that people actually want to dismiss it as being pagan is part of what actually gives us the best story of who God actually is in the midst of all of it. If we don't have the contrast of, the deep magic that comes out of Aslan and the attempted magic that we see out of Jadis, like we miss the entire contrast of what both we see within scripture and in the world, and what Lewis is trying to put forth. Jadis thought she had mastered the deep magic, and then it turned out she never understood it herself.
Yeah.
The idea of, even when you move forward throughout the books, anytime Jadis reappears, it's always an attempt at somebody to try to recreate what Aslan did without even trying.
Yeah.
If you just throw it out as witchcraft or paganism, like you miss an entire way of showing, especially because of being able to actually teach kids who God is and why we don't have to fear. I mean, ultimately, that's part of what the message is that we get from it, is that we don't have to fear because God does have us here.
Yeah. I also think that there's a beauty in the way that Lewis approaches the amalgamation of different belief systems that are present here, because Jadis is supposed to be a mythological creature from a different Abrahamic religion. And so you have this world that says, suppose that this stuff is real. Suppose that there is a version of magic. There are different creatures or sub-divine entities that have all of these powers. Suppose that there is this world, this multiverse of worlds that is governed by a deep magic established by this figure that we don't ever actually meet, is never actually given a form, is only ever spoken about, is only ever referenced here and there. And then that whole power structure brought forward in this larger than life creature named Aslan. And that we see a world, that we are introduced to a world that has been in conflict with a particular force of evil. And we see what happens as that evil is vanquished, but then a power vacuum is created. Because again, the first 3 books are all set one after another after another. And it's only really in the first one. Now there are fantasy elements obviously in all of them, but it's really the first one that really heavily emphasizes on an antagonistic force. Beyond that point, you have a power struggle between different humans within Narnia. So as you go through Prince Caspian, now we're switching gears to something that looks more 1-for-1 medieval. Now they're all medieval in context, in literature style. They're all supposed to be within the context of medieval literature, but those very direct themes are heightened in Caspian and then brought forward as a seafaring venture in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But then you have almost like a camera shift that says, okay, all of this stuff is going on. Okay, all of these things are happening. What else is happening? What else is happening off camera over here? So let's go over here as the story unfolds. And we're seeing in different ways Aslan introducing new people into the equation, working with different people, and engaging the world in different ways to continue to keep order and defend the good of this world that he created. And like you said, it isn't until the sixth book that we get the preamble of everything that led up to this point. And even to say that it's not a beat for beat story of every single solitary aspect of every single thing that happened up into this book, up into this point. No, you get creation, and you get the story of the first humans to hit the scene, and Aslan establishing kings and queens. But being honest about the introduction of this evil that won't be fully realized or fully vanquished for some time to come. But even after that, you still have all of that turmoil. You have all of that conflict that sits within this world. I mean, when you look at the way that Lewis establishes the long winter, right? So Jadis hits the scene and she starts the long winter. What's happening in the real world? So do yourself a favor and look up. There are a couple of different places that have them. There are timelines that juxtapose the events of Narnia with the events of the world. What happens? World War II. And what happens right after this this first book is written, and what is done? The long winter is ended. And so we're taking the topography, we're taking the events, we're taking the themes of this world and saying, suppose a version of these very same themes are present here. What if? And then you have everything that culminates into the last battle and the wrap up of this entire thing. And so before we get to the wrap up of Narnia and how this whole thing comes in for a landing, I'll go ahead and come up for air and let you go ahead and chime in with whatever you've got.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things is just something that I think is interesting that we just want to make sure that we actually just say, because we've been using the term and because of geek culture and everything, it has different meanings now. So the idea of the multiverse level of all of this stuff, is not Lewis really is the only one that has ever done what we're talking about here when we talk about multiverse, because Lewis is dealing with multiple worlds, not copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. Yeah. And when you talk about the multiverse theory, like with Spider-Man, you've got just copies of copies of copies of copies, all doing slightly different things, but they're all basically just carbon copies of the same thing in a different style. When you talk about things like the extended universe of things like Marvel, you have different worlds, but they're all within the same universe, all dealing with the same problems.
Yeah.
When Tolkien just created a universe and just left it. He didn't expand it out beyond, what they had for breakfast type of thing. But when you get to Lewis, you've got worlds, universes, all of them dealing with different problems, all of them having their own set of characters, all of them with their own backstories, and the only thing that connects all of them is Aslan in some form. And this is and the reason we can say this because Aslan tells us in one of the books of the idea of, I go by many different names. You need to figure out who I am in your world.
So there's two different times, and I'm gonna get to one of them once we get to the last chapter.
Right.
But he says that at the point of the within the original trilogy, and then actually goes as far as to physically establish that in the last book.
Right. And so because of that, that's how we know that's the only thing that connects these worlds together. And so it's from an artistic standpoint, I mean, you cannot look at what Lewis has done with the Narnia and say that this is just some kid's story. Like, this is one of the most complex creative literature pieces that you are going to be able to find. The second part of that is, and I think this is where we're going to end up anyway, but I'm going to say it now because I'm going to forget, just like I did when we were doing Misfits last week. The other thing that is interesting about, and that in some ways in reality, it should actually be more of a direct allegory to what we see in Scripture, even though nobody is going to recognize it in this way.
Mm-hmm.
Jadis, in reality, when you read Just the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and even some of Prince Caspian, you assume Jadis is the devil, and so that means that she is the direct enemy of Aslan throughout this whole thing.
Yeah.
But when you actually read the series, Jadis is not actually just the antagonist of Aslan. She is just one form of what Aslan is actually fighting against. Because you've got her directly in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but then when you get to Prince Caspian, you've got this whole new, like you're talking about the power vacuum, you've got this whole new enemy that is attacking the Narnian people. But even within the Narnian, the only time she comes back up here is because there are still people within the Narnian camps that want her back.
Yeah,
not because she's...
They believe that she is the only one that can liberate them from the rule of the Calormans.
And it's not because she's the devil. It's because she represents a power that wants to devour. Which is why she was the enemy in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe that had the most direct, like you're talking about, the most direct timeline reflection of World War II is what we see there in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. So that's what we have as the enemy. But then as we go through, the enemy keeps on changing.
Yeah.
But the enemy is still the same enemy that we had from the beginning, which is just a natural desire to go against what the Creator had intended for us, is all it simply is. It's not something where it is, a direct person is the devil. Right. It is, we see things like greed. We see things like, actual like imperial style power. We see things just of ignorance. We see things of pride. Like, these are what we see throughout all of it that in reality are what the enemy actually is. And we see it both in a foreign army, or we see it in just the internal battles between the characters that we've got going on in general.
Right. So this is where you get back to the conversation of the reading orders and the value of the different reading orders, and the fact that there is not one size fits all when it comes to this. Because on one hand, in order to get the gravity of the whole Polly and Diggory situation and the rings and him going to Charn and all of that sort of jazz, in order to get what the gravity of the people that are involved, well, there's an argument to be made for then going back to understanding, this is what happens as a result of everything that's happening here, and thus it lends weight to what is happening here, because you understand that Jadis is going to go forward as a menace to Narnia and to the Narnian people and all of that sort of jazz. But here's the reality. If Polly and Diggory never go to Charn, there's nothing that says Jadis and Aslan ever meet. There's nothing that says that they are ever enemies of one another, and we ever get the events of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so that's where it becomes painfully and woefully obvious that and you approaching The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you likewise to what I said just a couple of minutes ago, you don't get the very clear indication that you are not supposed to read Jadis as the stand-in for sin or evil unless you realize where she came from,
Right.
and you have the origin of her introduction into the story and realize she was brought over from a different world that sits within the multiversal dynamic of Narnia.
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch on on the comparison that you made between Marvel and Narnia. So, the most, to my knowledge, now hardcore nerds may be able to give me a better suited example, and absolutely please do. But from my experience, the closest, it's definitely not a carbon copy, but the closest comparison that we have to the style of multiverse that Lewis presents here is DC. That there are a series of different worlds that are different dimensions, but don't necessarily have exactly the same things going on. We see some that are vastly and wildly different, but the idea is, and this is where the Flash comes in, that he can vibrate his molecules at different frequencies and thus be able to travel from one dimension to another dimension to another dimension. And so it's this idea that they're almost layered on top of each other in the same way that Lewis takes the approach of saying, this is one world, this is another world, this is another world, and thus the wood between the worlds is a necessity, but a danger, that you shouldn't be staying in the wood for too long because you can have permanent amnesia, you can lose yourself, all of this kind of stuff. But that is the very foundation of the rings that are used and the theory behind how Santa Claus can go between all of these different worlds, that he was bestowed a trinket made up of the makings of the wood between the worlds, and why we have these different characters of Father Christmas, different from Santa in this world, Father Time, and all of that sort of stuff. We have these different characters, but that nexus point being the main connection piece between the various ones. And so that's kind of the closest comparison, but that's still not exactly what Lewis did here. And Lewis wrote this famously as a piece that invites people to bring your own what ifs to it, to suppose its own different theories and different aspects, even to the point where I have my own theory here. I believe that the world of the Ransom trilogy also exists in the same universe as Narnia. I'll take it a step further. I believe that Middle Earth also exists in the same universe as Narnia. And I think Lewis created the world in such a way that says, what if all of this is all connected? And what if here we know this all-powerful entity as the emperor over the sea? But in Middle Earth, they know him as, I think the correlation point is Tom Bombadil. I just probably pissed off a whole bunch of geeks if I got that one wrong.
Tom Bombadil is just it would be Eru would be the one that would be
okay. My bad.
I think it's Eru. Now I'm questioning myself.
Well, I'm glad that I'm not the only one that may have pissed off some Tolkien fans.
Yeah, definitely not Tom Bombadil, but yeah. Anyway,
okay. So anyway, but that's so that's kind of the layout of the universe. And so we wrap this thing up with the last battle, and this is where a lot of the controversy tends to sit. Because, spoilers ahead, if you have not read the Narniad, then, but this whole thing kind of ends in, some say, a really big climactic moment, depending on which part of the story you're looking at, and some say kind of a whimper if you're looking at a different part of the story. And so we have this world where the Pevensey children are no longer in Narnia. They've been told they can't come back for now, that they're not old enough, all of this. And we kind of see almost like a degradation of the world, and things seem to not really be going well. And you have this talking ape that convinces this donkey to dress up like Aslan and to pretend to be Aslan and to lead the people, and because they know what's best. They can lead the people well. And so all the while, if there is a stand-in for an adversary to Aslan that fits more but still isn't, it's Tash.
Mm-hmm.
It's this other deity that is worshipped by others and is described almost like this serpent bird-like creature that devours men and is this horrific entity. And you have folks coming into a private location to come see Aslan. Well, it turns out that's Tash. And so you have this almost darkest hour sort of setting happening in Narnia, juxtaposed with a train ride. Turns out that all of the quote-unquote friends of Narnia are all on this train with a shared idea. They're going to go back. The rings that were established previously. Now, again, they were just established in the book prior. If you're reading in publication order, they're established to have connective powers. So if one person's wearing one and is held on to all of these other people, well, all of the people will be transported. So the idea is that they can use the magic to take them back to Narnia. Well, it's kind of left ambiguous at first when they're all on the train, but they all end up back in Narnia. And they all end up in the final throes of this world. And they enter into this same spot where these other people entered into, but their perspective is different. They're seeing the beauty. They see Aslan. They're willing to see what is in front of them where others don't see Aslan. They cannot see the beauty that is in front of them because they have elected not to. Mm-hmm. Again, themes, not allegory, but themes. Turns out there's a big train wreck, like literally in the real world. All of the friends of Narnia killed. Now, the only one that's left alive is the only one that is no longer a friend of Narnia, and that is Susan. Now, that gets to where such an important aspect of Narnian storytelling comes into play. It's the morality of it all. It's the open world of it all. It's the non-final approach that Lewis takes with the world that he's built. But you have this moment where Aslan hits the scene and invites them into Aslan's country. We keep hearing about Aslan's country, a world realer than anything else, even to the point where you see England not destroyed by the bombs, not devastated by the war, that the castle is all beautiful and pristine and you see this mark of this is where the real story begins, and we see that Aslan calls back the stars, and we see the decreation event, and the chapter of this version of Narnia, the fake version of Narnia, being laid to rest. That there would no longer be these different portals bringing people into this temporary existence, that you wouldn't have temporary, because it's always set up that there are temporary entry points into Narnia, but you can never use the same portal twice.
Mm-hmm.
Even down to the wardrobe, you don't get the value of the wardrobe until you get and the backstory of the wardrobe until you find out about the tree that the wardrobe was built from, and why this wardrobe is a portal into Narnia, but it's only a portal once into Narnia. And so you get now the real thing. And that's where I had mentioned before, when you had said about you'll know me by a different name, you have to get to know me there. That's where Lewis very plainly states who, without using the words, but in every other approach, very clearly posits, this is who we've been following the entire time. Mm-hmm. This is this person who has been sitting on the fringes of staying myth. Again, showing, not telling, the whole idea of myth in juxtaposition to Middle Earth, but now fully brought forward into the most realized version of who he is, and establishing this is the real world. But we get into this whole thing of what literary folks have established after the fact, and commentarians have established after the fact, as the problem of Susan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
Do you want to jump in before I get there?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I actually read Last Battle, and so I can't even remember if this is the scene I'm thinking of is in there, or if it's one of the others. One of the things that I, even when I was younger, like high school age, probably younger, noticed is there's a very distinct contrast between Peter and Susan throughout the entirety of the Narniad, but especially here towards the end. Because we have this picture of Susan who just like, it was fun, it was a dream, it was whatever, forget about it. And then there's a very distinct scene, I can't remember specifically which one it's in, but where there's, Peter basically is they're almost having a vision. And Peter calls out, as an adult at this point, it's like, I am Peter, your high king.
Yeah.
And it's a very striking difference between somebody who's like, as fun as kids, it was just a dream, to somebody who had taken the title that was given to him by his God and made it his identity, even when nobody else recognized what that meant or believed any of it. Mm-hmm. That was who he identified himself as.
Yeah.
Compared to somebody who had been given a similar title. She was the queen. All throughout the other stories, whenever the Pevensey children appear, they are still referred to as they are the ones in charge. Nobody overrules them.
Yeah.
But yet, she's like, I don't need any of this. Whereas Peter, it's still his identity all the way through, is the identity that was given to him by his God is the one that he's going to carry with him. And it's a very distinct contrast of character arcs going through, 7 books over, however 6-7 years that he wrote them.
Yeah.
You can't deny what's going on. Like you said, there's no way the nice thing about he actually leave plot holes, wrap everything nicely in a bow first at the end there. he's saying here as far as what it is that we are supposed to be looking like as well.
And meanwhile, though, he is speaking to aspects of reality in a very human way. Again, he had walked away from his faith as a child, and then in his 30s came back to faith.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you start to get the theological works. That's when you start to get all of these things from him that we all know and love. But he had to go through all of this stuff first. And so it makes all of the sense in the world that he would write a figure in. But the thing to remember is after the fact, he would receive letters from kids. He would receive things that saying, okay, what about an eighth book? Will you write an eighth book that follows up with Susan? And he famously told a child, write it yourself. Go ahead and write and say, because this world is open. He left the world open. He's not giving you every single minute detail. That's the entirety of the world building. He's giving you tentpole events throughout the series to continue on the story, to talk about different aspects of this world, to flesh out different components of this world, different entities within this world, different areas within this world, not to give you the full and exhaustive history of the world of Narnia.
What they had for
Likewise, exactly. Likewise, he opens the door to say, Susan can become a friend of Narnia.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not a matter of, oh, he killed his entire family, or he killed her entire family just so that way they could come back. That's speaking into the story. Likewise, the whole idea of the problem of Susan is that it posits that C.S. Lewis was a chauvinist, essentially, that he was anti-womanhood, that he spoke against her being a woman or being into womanly things, and thus she is held back from Narnia. Likewise, positing that Aslan killed her entire family so that way they could come back to Narnia, and thus leaving Susan by herself. All of these things are read-ins. All of these things are extra from the text. And it assumes motive behind Lewis's morality or Lewis's approach that isn't actually ever stated or ever present at all.
And now I'll get to be the one that was like, wow, he's mean for once. And honestly, it is fed by the same desire to make the entire Narniad a allegory to the entirety of Scripture. Yeah. Because it's the same arguments and attitudes that we see from people that want to make God out to be a chauvinist and, I mean, a masochist in a lot of ways. You know, the idea that he just kills people for his pleasure, that he makes people suffer, that if the woman isn't woman enough, then it's not good enough for God. Like those are things that people have been reading into Scripture for a long time. Yeah. And then they get to something like this and they want to go ahead and read it into this as well because they think that's supposed to be an allegory of Scripture, so we're going to make it that. Yeah. And it again is something where in doing so, you again miss, one, the beauty of what Lewis is actually saying here from a soteriological perspective. And two, you again you're making a God in your own image, which is in a lot of ways what every single one of these books is dealing with, is how to prevent yourself from getting to that point. I mean, that was the whole issue in Prince Caspian, is that Peter's trying too hard to be king again. He wants to fix everything himself. You know, Jadis wanted to rule because that was she wanted it for herself. Edmund wants everything for himself, gets turned into a dragon. Right? I mean, the whole thing with Shift and Puzzle is, again, Shift wants everything for himself. It is very much we're going to create gods in our own image because then it suits us. And in doing so, we miss the story as a whole, and then we also miss what God is able to tell us through stories like this.
Yeah. I will voice the comment section right now, so that way, if you all are watching, and I will go ahead and correct him for you before you guys go ahead and type. It's Eustace that's turned into a dragon.
Yeah, sorry, whatever.
That's turned into a dragon.
Ease. They're all in the way.
They're all in the way. Anyway, so that it's important to understand that Lewis has created a world here that's open to addition, that's open to supposing, that's open to asking what if and giving theories. It's not hardline stances on morality or genderhood or any of those things. And so I just would strongly suggest that as you approach the Narniad, try to see the big picture. Try to see the entirety of what's happening, because that friends, that's part of why I love this, because you can get into the individual dynamics of each one of the characters, that you can get into the dynamics of Lucy and her ability to see Aslan when others couldn't, and the choices that are made by the kids. Is this moral? Is this not moral? What does this say about humanity? What does this say about when you're trying to follow orders? You can get into that layer of it. Likewise, you can look at the grand scheme and say, oh, this is a world where a little bit of this is possible and a little bit of that is possible. So if all of these things are possible, and if we have not closed the wood between the worlds, and we know that one of the places accessible in the wood is Aslan's country, then what's to say that Susan cannot ultimately become a friend of Narnia? Again, not writing a closed canon. This is very, very open. And so I'd like to make a couple of recommendations for you all. Spotify has an audiobook series of Narnia that is aces. It is prime, including The Last Battle, read by Patrick Stewart. You have not experienced that book until you have heard Patrick Stewart doing all of the voices, doing the entire thing, and just chewing this scenery the entire time. I would suggest go back and revisit the trilogy of movies that came out in the early aughts. I think they're good. I think they're large in scale enough. I hope that we get an entire canon. We get an entire series of movies that are just, let's tell the entirety of the story, pick a lane, and just rock it. Whatever way you want to do it, if you want to start at Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe and go through in publication order, or if you want to start at the beginning of the story and go in chronological order, just go for it and swing for the fences. I would be here for that. But until then, that is the Spotify version is good. The BBC one is not bad. It's almost like if you want to revisit in like an old English sort of setting and have that ambiance of the whole thing, I think that is also a really good way of engaging with the text.
Yeah, the BBC one gives you a little bit of a nostalgic feel because it feels like you're getting it actually from Lewis.
Yes,
but
yes, absolutely.
If you also are afraid that it's going to put you asleep while you're driving listening to it, you're probably better off going Patrick Stewart.
Yeah. So I just, as we wrap up, I encourage you, do not be afraid to explore this wonderful series. Do not be afraid to explore different contexts of these different stories, and that includes some of these other ones. Now, granted, some of the creators have come out to say really, really obnoxious stuff over the years. And if you cannot separate art from artist, I mean, in all fairness, she also came out and said some really stupid stuff about the problem of Susan also, in addition to all of the other things that she said about the creators of Harry Potter, or the characters of Harry Potter and all of these different things. Just saying, if you can't separate art from artist, I don't blame you. But if you can, do not be afraid to approach these worlds, because it's fantasy, y'all. You're not jumping into heresy just because you've approached these different these different modes of storytelling. And especially with Narnia, it dares you to imagine. It dares you to engage that fantasy part of your brain and say, truly, what if? So, you will likely be seeing this on one of our many channels. This is one that's going to be a crossover among a variety of our different projects within KFM Broadcasting. If you're watching this on Thoughts from a Bearded Geek, if you're watching this on Ministry Misfits, if you're watching this on Buddy Walk with Jesus, if you're watching this on any of the other channels, then you are watching one of the different branches of our broadcast network, KFM Broadcasting. Now, we have a big announcement that we have launched. I believe it's live now. By the time that you all are going to be watching this or listening to this, there is a store. So if you want to support our network of creators, if you want some awesome swag designed by our own resident design artist, Andrew here.
The colorblind one.
The colorblind one is the guy that we hired to do the whole thing. So,
which is why we went black and white for our logo.
Exactly. Then they link to be able to find all of that stuff. You will find in the description of wherever it is that you are finding this.
And then in addition to that, you also can find links for the social media channels that we have up at the moment. For all of the KFM broadcasting stuff, we're slowly getting onto most of the major ones. It's just taking a little bit of time because there's a lot of them. And so you'll be able to find that, and then you'll be able to stay up to date on all of that. And then we're hoping to be able to finally get the website up and launched by the beginning of 2025. So.
All right, so that's it. That's all. That's a wrap. Thank you all for joining us, and until next time, peace.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Faust are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.